Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I think we're expecting a few more over the next few minutes, so I'll keep an eye out and let them in as and when they join. So let's bring up the presentation and get cracking. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so today's topic is the difference between bike fit and cycling analysis. So we're gonna go through the main differences. Obviously, we're going to touch on a little bit on the process of analysis, what that is, how you can apply it to your bike fit, and then we will also sort of run through how we apply that analysis principle to our bike fitting, or as we call it, the cycling analysis services that we offer. So to get started, what is bike fit? Well, obviously over the years bike fit has sort of evolved rapidly. It's splintered into multiple different approaches, and there's no common standard in a lot of cases. Obviously I'm a little biased, but the IBFI is kind of working on that, and we're trying to get some more common ground. But at the moment, there's no performance or education benchmark to reach in order to be considered a bike fitter. It's not a protected term. Anybody can become a bike fitter without any training if they wanted to, and that's kind of one of the things that has harmed the reputation of fitters in the past. Bike fitting means many different things to consumers and retailers, and I think that's a key one to kind of to focus on. So one of the difficulties with bike fit is that it may be the case that a consumer has a bad experience with a particular fitter, and then they tell all of their friends that bike fit's pointless, it doesn't do anything, or they have an experience of a low quality of service in terms of maybe it's not professional, maybe it's not the level of detail that we go through and that we're going to explain here today. And so they think that it's just, oh, they measured my inside leg, worked out that Greg LeMond formula, and away they go. And I'm not paying $200 for that, or whatever it is. And so to try and get some kind of common ground where, as a consumer, you can be a little bit more confident that the service you receive in different places is going to be of a similar quality and a similar end result. Because the process as to how you get to that end result may differ, and there's no bad thing about that, but it's the end result that matters, and the service that the client goes through as part of that. So yeah, the services vary wildly on both ends of the fitting spectrum, from basic floor sizing to advanced cycling analysis. So bike fit, we just mentioned that it's a term that people sometimes confuse or have some difficulty with. So it might be as simple as a bike sizing, and they just get you sat on a bike on a stationary turbo trainer, indoor trainer, just move things around a little bit and go, yeah, that's the one you need to buy. And then the client leaves thinking they've had a bike fit. It could be that simple. And then equally, it could be right up to something that we consider cycling analysis, with a lot of tech, a lot of process, a lot of different aspects to that 3-hour appointment. So modern fitting has evolved. Success is gained by optimizing your fit training, aptitude, and knowledge, and that's the one that I really emphasize. Porrick does as well, and personally, I'm a nerd, I'll admit that. I'm a big fan of learning, a big fan of education. I like to learn as much as I can. So for me, fit training and knowledge are absolutely key elements to the process. Fit repetition, continuing education, mentoring. When you learn what to do, the key thing is then learning how to implement what you know. So there's definitely a knowledge and a skill separation with fit. So you can be the most knowledgeable fitter in the world, but if you can't apply that to the client, and you can't get the buy-in from the client, then ultimately that knowledge is kind of going to waste. Fit environment, very, very important as far as the client's experience goes. And you have to think about the client's experience, and we're going to touch on this quite a lot today. But if they don't come out of it thinking that was professional, thorough, and well informed, and I know why the changes that have been made, then they're less likely to persevere with it if it feels strange. And everybody knows that if they see a client with a horrendous position and you make some pretty big changes, to them that's going to feel weird. It doesn't feel better straight away just because it is a better position. It could just feel very, very odd. So for them to buy into what you're doing, to commit to those changes, they have to have confidence in you as a fitter. And your fit environment, the education, the knowledge that you put across play a big part in that. The fit technology as well can be really important. So if they see that things are being measured and done scientifically and systematically, I think they have a little bit more faith, as long as the fit isn't taken over by the technology and you know, they feel like it's this equals that, therefore you're done kind of thing. That's one of the negatives that has been thrown at technology, but I think that's just inexperienced technology users that kind of suffer from that issue. Fit process, we're going to mention that again a fair bit today. So we're firm believers in the fact that with every client, no matter what they come in with, we'll go through the same process. And that's just purely to make sure that we don't miss anything. But we'll cover that in a lot more detail later on. So being the ideal fitter, walking the walk, it's basically combining all of those points and you know, doing what you know is the best approach. Fit investment and return on investment. Obviously, there are some really expensive pieces of technology out there, and you've got to make sure that that when you purchase something like that, the increase in fit revenue that comes alongside it is going to eventually cover the cost of purchasing the equipment in the first place. So that's something a lot of people overlook, but it really is key. And you as a fitter have to decide what's best for your service, for your market, to use the best technology for the kind of return that you're going to get from fitting. So diving straight into the bike fit versus cycling analysis comparison, what we've tried to do here is kind of split the screen so that you've got bike fitting on one side and cycling analysis on the other. So we'll start off with bike fitting because it's a little bit smaller and potentially more constrained. So it's analysis or observation and interaction with cyclists to optimize comfort, power, and performance. That's a kind of short summary. And obviously, as we said earlier, everybody interprets bike fit as being something different, and there's a lot of variability in how a fitter may define what they do. So that's just a bit of a catch-all and something that we've taken as a standard. So don't be offended if you think that your interpretation of bike fitting is more expansive. It's a very personal thing for each fitter, but that's something that we can hang a hat on and say, as an industry, this is a fairly common interpretation of what bike fitting is. The common tools used are your eye, obviously. You look at the rider, you look at them on bike, off bike, all those kinds of things. EQ is sort of the emotional and connection to your rider, that kind of empathy and sympathy, the experience that they're going to go through, motion capture potentially, some static tools like a plumb bob has been historically used, static goniometers maybe, things like that. Laser levels could be included in there as well. Guidelines and generalities are sort of, with the history of bike fit, people have tried to turn it into a simple process that can be applied by almost anybody. So imagine as a shop, a retail store, it very much used to be the case that the person who was least busy had to go on the bike fit training, and so you know they didn't go because they wanted to be there, they went because they were told to be there, and maybe they were the least busy in the shop because they were less able or less engaged in the first place. So Bike Fit educators had to react to that, and therefore the education that they created had to be a little bit more formulaic, a little bit more, if you see this, then this is the intervention that you make. And you know, I think that gets you so far. In a previous webinar on technology and bike fit, we talked about the training wheels of bike fitting, and those generalities, those guidelines are exactly those training wheels. So it's to try and get people started, get people up and running without causing too much of an issue to the client that you're working with. So best practice as well is kind of built into that, and excuse me, and it's trying to move towards something that is robust, and there are some standards there as well. So that's historically maybe a little bit of a restrictive view of what bike fitting has been, but what it's becoming and what we do as part of what people consider to be our bike fitting services, but we call cycling analysis, is a little bit more in depth. So data capture, we consider that to be a key part of it. Don't get confused between data capture and the use of technology. Data doesn't have to be collected by a 10 grand system. Data is data, it's just information. So you can gather that from the physical assessment, the foot assessment, from looking, from observing, from questioning. There's lots of different ways to capture data and then make decisions based on that data. So analysis, that's the key point. Once you've gathered that data, you analyze it to identify patterns, to identify what might be the problem. Observation, we've already mentioned, that's another way of collecting that data. Comparative measurable kinematics and kinetic norms. So that would involve a little bit of technology. On the bike, tissue, joint evals, off the bike, tissue and joint evals as well. Customer-centric, evidence-based communication to track, quantify, and communicate patterns of movement and changes in kinematics. So one of the key things where we differ from traditional bike fit is trying to take the customer along that journey with us. So we start off gathering data. We come up with a hypothesis based on that data, and then we test that hypothesis, and it might be that we'll go through an example later on that explains this in a bit more detail, but it might be that our hypothesis is correct, but along that process, what we've been able to do is take some measurements with video capture, with other systems that can kind of say, well, this is where you were before. After the intervention we made, this is where you are now. And if we can show improvements, if we can explain to the customer why we've done what we've done and how it's benefited them, again, they're much more likely to stick with the changes we've made, even if they feel a bit strange to begin with, and trust the process that we're going through. So it's no longer subjective, kind of, I'm looking at you and I'm thinking, yeah, okay, your saddle height could go up a little bit. I think the problem with subjective fitting like that is twofold. Firstly, you have to have a very well-trained eye to do it well. There are some fantastic fitters out there with eyes that are far more experienced and skilled than mine. So there are people that can do it, but the majority of people, I think, see what they want to see. There's this kind of bias of, well, there are dozens of different types of biases, but it could be confirmation bias. It could be, you know, this is my hypothesis. I think this is going to happen when we raise the saddle. Oh, look, it has happened, but actually maybe it didn't happen. They just wanted to see it. So there's a little bit of difficulty with interpreting those changes. And really, the second thing is that the customer has to believe in your reputation as a fitter in that case, because you're not showing them that you've made a change and it has changed, and you're able to measure it and you know, show them a different joint angle or a different pressure mat or whatever. You're asking them to take your decision on faith. And again, some fitters, excellent reputations, very, very well known, and the people that come through their doors are there because of the reputation of that fitter. But Equally, there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of fitters out there who don't have those reputations. And maybe one of the ways to build that reputation is to do it on facts and on scientific measurements. So we feel strongly about measuring, being scientific, being reproducible. Reproducibility is a massive thing. If somebody comes in for a fit on one day and we measure some stuff, and then they go away, ride it, some adaptation occurs, come back, we can measure it, compare it to the last time they were in, and we can see what changes have been made. So it really is important to be able to measure, to be able to demonstrate the changes that are being made, and why you've made those alterations to the bike. Final points there: gathering biometric data, pressure, assessing tissue readiness post-injury, and measuring drag parameters. So those are all things that we can do on top of the traditional bike fit. And the tools, I'll just run through some of these: 2D, 3D analysis. So we put in 360 analysis there, which is again a big pillar of what we think is important in a bike fit, which is observation from the 4 main planes, so left, right, front, and back. If you're not looking at all of them, you're definitely missing something. So that's a big part of what we consider important in a bike fit. Biometric data gathering could be heart rate, could be breath rate, all those kinds of things. Contact point pressure monitoring. As you're aware, we're big fans of the BMI system and pressure mapping. Ventilatory response monitoring, live field measurements, pedal force analysis, aero analysis. All these tools in bike fit. We talked about the technology in the last presentation, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but anything that can give you additional information that can help you make that decision and help you support that theory. So if you haven't seen our webinars on critical reasoning, this really harks back to building up multiple pieces of evidence that point in the same direction. And the more evidence you gather to begin with, whether it's with technology or observation or discussion, whatever it may be, the more data you have to begin with, the more likely you're going to make a good decision at the end of that. Porrick, is there anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little piece of the history. So to me, bike fitting is an adjective. It's not a profession. It's a description of an activity. And in the early 2000s, when I first came to the US, it was very apparent that every store would profess that they bike fit. And what we were trying to do at the time was say, well, you know, we've structured it, we have a fit studio, we have all this technology, but people really weren't able to grasp the fact that my bike fit might be different to somebody else's. So for about 10 years, the question that we used to ask people was, have you ever had a professional bike fit? And that made the person stop for just a second and say, I've had a bike fit. What's a professional bike fit? And that gave us this opportunity to say to the person, well, we've worked with a professional body, we've been certified, we undergo regular training, and we have a dedicated studio, and we have a process that we follow. And, you know, these are our fit palmares. These are all the things we've accomplished. So for a while that served our purposes pretty well, but then it became apparent that this was becoming progressively more confusing. So then I tried to come up with a term that we first started talking about in early 2010, was how can we elevate beyond bike fit, because it was becoming an adjective. It's a descriptor. It's, you know, I'll do a bike fit for free when you're buying a hybrid, whereas really it's a sizing. Or I haven't had any formal training, but I used to be a very fast cyclist, so now I'm a bike fitter and I know what to do. So the term cycling analysis was our attempt to say to the industry, or to say to all of the professionals like yourself on this call today, that listen, if we're going to analyze things and we're going to have a rigorous process and we're going to really dig deep into having a more scientific process, you know, gathering data, analyzing the data, forming a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, going back and making sure that everything made sense, and then running through the process systemically. That's different to someone who's taken a 3-day course and does one bike fit a month. or somebody who's taken a measurement, or someone who's using a measurement-based system. So cycling analysis is mindset. It's an idea. It's a philosophy that, you know, can help empower and push us and differentiate us as a group of human movement professionals, as a group of people who really care about how do we move this field that we're all in and that we've decided to do as for a living. How do we move that forward? And this is an idea. It's a movement. It's something that if we all build it together and help elevate ourselves, it could be part of making our careers and our differentiation between other fitters more clear. So I just wanted to give a little bit of that history and give a little bit of why we think the term is important, and then also that this mindset and this elevating ourselves beyond a term that doesn't fit what most of us do. You know, it's a mindset as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think that's a great addition there. And this, I think I'll let you run through this. This is one of your sort of key slides. So if you want to take over again on this one.
I think the thing that we have to remember is that if we're going to elevate ourselves and say we're a profession, if we look at the 4 quadrants on this graph, and I've put this up in front of thousands of people at this point, it seems like we focus on the top left quadrant the most. So, and the top left quadrant of the circle the most. So, and that's the notion that if I'm trained, I'm a bike fitter. But when you're a professional, you know, if you think about a recruiter trying to hire somebody for a job, you know, and Andy alluded to this earlier, a lot of the time people end up in the bike fitting seat on the bus and they're just happen to fall into it. Whereas if we look at that other box that's to the left of that first quadrant called training, we have EQ, which is your emotional quotient. Dr. T from Trek, who's Dr. Mark Timmerman, has coined this phrase of your bike side manner. Now, bike side manner basically comes down to, like a doctor would say, your bedside manner. Your bike side manner is how you treat people, how they feel. Now, I know a lot of assholes that are bike fitters, but they're super knowledgeable. They've been really fast on a bike, or they've been fitting for a long time, but they're not personable. So if we were to think about this as a profession, as a movement, as an amazing force for change going forward, we're going to put people in the fit studio that are amazing communicators. Or if you don't have those skills, you develop them. There's 500 courses you can take on EQ or developing your emotional quotient. And it's empathy, it's communication skills, it's a lot of things. And then how do we hire for a bike fitter? You know, we have to put behind us this, you organically morph into being a bike fitter because that you're just the guy. You know, we have to hire people that maybe do have a little bit of anatomy or physiology background, that are interested in working with people. We hire in our company for people that have amazing EQ, have a pretty good background and everything, because a fitter that's super communicator, super nice, even though they mightn't be the best fitter in the world, that can be developed. And if they have a great interaction with the person in a great environment, under great circumstances, even if it's not perfect, that person can call them up and say, you know what, you told me we might have to tweak something. I think we got to tweak it a little bit. And they still maintain the continuity of that person. And then the other thing with training is post-training, there has to be some sort of quality control. And that quality control is quality control of the process that they're being trained in. And we talked in one of our webinars about this notion of the paratrooper bike fitter. And the paratrooper bike fitter is, you're in for knee pain, I'm going to focus all my attention on your cleats and frontal plane, and that's what I'm focusing on really intensely. However, a professional fitter that does an amazing physical assessment, an amazing interview, looks at the feet and really studies and explores what the heck's going on, makes sure they have a great contact point interface, saddle height, your extension, your knee joint position. I don't care what philosophy you aspire to, but you have that dialed in. They've got great foot support. You've looked at the front end of the bike. They're not overstretching. They're not too long, not too short. By the time you turn that person around, that camera faces you in the frontal plane, there's no knee problem left. It's gone. because you followed a rigorous process, rather than parachuting in with wedges and shims or a whole bunch of other things that are just the paratrooper mindset. So a professional fitter and a professional fitting organization is going to have a process that's rigorously followed, and they're going to be able to refer back to that dysfunctional movement at the very beginning, which was knee pain, but they're not going to focus exclusively on that because it's a process. If we go into the second quadrant, and we talk about tools, if we talk about a motor mechanic or somebody working on cars, they spend tens of thousands of dollars on their tools to work on whatever brand of car they work on. In the bike business, we don't put emphasis into, the simple things like maintaining the things that we need to do our jobs. And that can be simple things like your torque wrenches and all those sort of things. But if you have a motion capture system, if you have pressure tools, are they calibrated? Are they working the way they should? Do you have a plan when something goes wrong? How do all those tools of your trade, how do you maintain them? How do you build a beautiful fit studio and have that amazing environment that when that person comes in, they think professionalism, they think, holy moly, this place is beautiful. He just opened his tool tray and all his Allen keys and everything are just in there. They're not just thrown into a box somewhere. Those kind of things create an impression. Then we move into the next thing, the software, hardware, and data. And one of the things we've had Andy work on since he started here is this notion of how do we communicate? So when somebody calls our business to book a fit, we gather information. When it goes into a fitter's calendar, how do all those things integrate and communicate? When a fitter tells Andy, hey, my 50th's coming up and I want to buy a bike in June and my wife's all excited about it, or I've got a competition, how do we turn around and put something in the calendar that makes us think, hey, John is going to buy his 50th anniversary or whatever it is bike and do all those things. So we get a lot of information in a bike fit. We get a lot of information about what that client wants, what they need. What do we do with that? How do we weaponize it? How do we turn it into an asset for ourselves and our fit thing? And then the final quadrant is integration and systems. How do fitters work with bike mechanics? How do fitters work with coaches? How do you work with purchasing? We have days when a customer will come in with 3 bikes and every single saddle of a certain type is now gone. So how do we have min-maxes that all that works? How do we have the supplies we need? How do we have motion capture dots? How do we have all those things? Now, when you think about fit as this 4-wheel entity now if we're going to be professionals and we're going to be cycling analysis professionals, or we're going to be elevating ourselves, when we think about bike fit, we move out of that first quadrant and what training we've had and what we do, and we think about it as a profession. You wouldn't buy a mechanic, a work stand, and the biggest tool kit that Park or whatever brand sells and say, there you go, you're a bike mechanic. Every bike store knows that the way we create a successful fitting business or a successful service department, it's policies, it's procedures, it's ways of writing service, it's a lot of different things, but it's not just throw a bunch of shit at somebody and say, off you go. And the two biggest reasons fit doesn't succeed as a profession is the personability and communication, the EQ component, and the second one is that they don't integrate everything into the rest of their business, and it's not a holistic kind of a process. All right, let's move on. I got on my soapbox there, sorry.
No, that's fine. I think that's really good, and it flowed on well from the previous slide. So I just thought it was best if you just kind of continued. So on the analysis side, and we kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the definition of an analysis is detailed examination of the elements or structure of something, and that's key. A detailed examination. It's not I've seen this, so therefore I do that. It's not I want to get this person's knee angle between 30 and 40 or whatever. It's not formulaic, it's not generic. It's a detailed examination of the elements. And the next slide will kind of go into that in a bit more detail, but it's not this is my so Park talks about procedure, and procedure is really, really key to make sure that you catch everything. But when you come across something, let's say the single leg squat, actually we'll talk about it on the next slide, because the next slide is about exactly this. But so analysis isn't a formulaic approach. It's not if this then that. It's very much let's look at all the data in front of us, analyze it and make a decision based on that. So it's asking questions, collecting data to better understand the why. So it's not just a case of they are doing this, therefore I put in that. It's a case of why are they doing it? Not everybody has the same movement pattern for the same reason, and we need to identify what the reason is behind their strange or undesired movement pattern. So single leg squat. This is a really, really good example, I think, because a lot of physical assessments taught by existing bike fit educators, again, they're a little bit restricted because they're of the market that they're working with, and sometimes they have to make things that little bit more formulaic. So it might be that in traditional bike fitting education years ago, they would have just said, do a single leg squat, look at the person from the front. If the knee collapses inwards, medially towards the midline of the body, install some insoles and move on to the next thing. Now, that doesn't fit with the approach that we use and the approach that we recommend, which is if we're doing a single leg squat, firstly, we're not only going to look at them from the front, we're also going to look at them from the side. Looking at them from the side, we can get an idea for whether the knee comes forwards over the toes, whether the knee stays pretty stationary or far back, and they just bend backwards, and that'll give you some indication as to whether they're glute dominant or quad dominant. So that's key. Firstly, that's something that we never used to do in bike fit. So there's more information there than just looking at one plane, and that's very, very true of bike fitting. But if we did see the knee collapse medially, what would we do? Well, firstly, we'd install an insole potentially and see whether it changed. If it doesn't change, then maybe it's not caused by the insole, or maybe the arch support isn't sufficient. So then it could be a medial glute weakness. So the medial glute is responsible for pulling the leg out to the side. If it's not strong enough to hold the knee outwards, then that knee's going to collapse inwards. So we could do a resisted side lying leg raise on the massage table. Do both sides, see how strong they are. If there's good strength there and the insole doesn't make any difference, then the next stage is to look at them on the bike. And if that knee is collapsing inwards in a single leg squat, does that repeat on the bike? Because if it doesn't repeat on the bike, then maybe we don't actually need to do a great deal about it. We don't need to be very formulaic and if this, then this, because it could be that in a single leg squat, the motor firing patterns just aren't as developed. So they're not used to firing the glute when they're doing a squat. But when they're on the bike, they do fire the glute and it pulls that knee straight again. It could be that the insole functions differently when they're in a cycling shoe. It could be lots of different things. So we need to assess whether or not those movement patterns occur on the bike and then decide whether or not to intervene. And with all of these interventions, again, the objective is to make the movement pattern less of a concern, because the reason that we're getting involved with single leg squats, if that knee collapses medially, is that it has been correlated with knee pain, and that's what we're trying to reduce the risk of. So again, there's a pain aspect to this. Even if the knee collapses inwards, are they in pain currently? If they're not, maybe we concentrate on the thing that is causing them pain. Obviously, we want to reduce their risk of pain, so we would like the knee to collapse internally less. Yeah, okay. So Dean's just messaged me, and I'll read that in just a second because it is a key point. So if we're not seeing pain, if we're making an intervention purely to reduce their risk of pain that they're not experiencing anyway, actually are we better off focusing on something that is causing them pain or is causing them an issue? So, going through this process of collecting as much information as you can and trying to identify what's causing these issues in the first place gives us a better starting point to decide what we need to intervene with and what potentially is less of a concern.
I just have one point I wanted to make on that, Andy.
Yep.
And it's that concept of you have an assessment positive. In other words, you find something in the assessment where you think it's an issue. And this is part of where technology can be very helpful. Sometimes you'll see a dysfunctional screening in a particular thing, and single leg squat is a great example. But when we talk about cross-correlating evidence and we talk about analyzing evidence, if we have knee pain we have a history of maybe low back pain, we assess something, we see a dysfunctional movement pattern, it's really important that when we see them on the bike, that you document their initial movement characteristics and patterns rather than be, start off fixing things straight away. So, and this is another principle of cycling analysis. So the first thing we do, and we'll show you some video of this in a second, is we do what's called a 360 analysis. And it's a good principle of business too, to find, hey, this is how everything started. This is before we touched anything. Because if for no other reason that if you're going to be transparent about what you do, you show the person this was the movement dysfunction initially, and now it's this. So you can do this before and after all the time. Here's what we fixed. And it's a principle of cycling analysis that when you're trying to figure out something that's going on, you have to capture those initial kinematics, those initial movement patterns. If you're using pressure mapping or any of those other things, the Hippocratic oath in the doctor is do no harm. But a lot of the times we can convince ourselves we have to change something, or we convince ourselves there is movement dysfunction. You have to capture that base kinematic, that base picture of the person. And that's why we do an interview. That's why we do a physical assessment. That's why we do a foot assessment. And that's why we do the 360 analysis we will talk about later. But capturing that initial dysfunction and correlating it to the other things, or the lack of a movement dysfunction, like Andy said, it's very important.
Yeah, so the point that Dean raised was that the nomenclature needs to be standardized. So he mentioned it in reference to muscles in particular, but I think it's something that we need to standardize across all our descriptive terms. We did a webinar a few months ago now on anatomy, and some of those descriptive terms of where something is relative to other body parts and how to describe movement. And those are all key. Firstly, because if you're going to create a multidisciplinary team and work with physiotherapists or chiropractors, osteopaths, anybody medical, they're going to be using certain terms that we haven't historically in bike fit. And if we're using the same terms as them, it's much easier to communicate, it's much easier to build that professional respect. So when it comes to muscle names and things like that, sometimes we use terms to describe what the muscle does rather than the muscle name. So we talk about hip abductors or adductors rather than the actual muscle. So creating some consistency there so that people can use common language and more easily understand each other is again a step towards professionalizing what we do and how we do it. So this chain of evidence slide is something that we've pulled through from a previous webinar, and really it goes back to that analysis point. So you're gathering data in lots of different ways. Our standard fit goes through at least these 4 sections. So it's an interview to discuss things that you may not be able to gather in any other way. So injury history, all those kinds of things. Unless there's a big scar on the side of their knee, you're not necessarily going to know that they've had an operation without talking to them and finding all of this thing out. And the interview needs to be so much more extensive than a lot of bike fitters go into that level of detail. So I find when I'm talking to people about their injury history, because they're in a cycling setting, because they're coming with their bike, they straight away they focus in on the cycling related injuries, and then you tease it out a little bit more and you say, what other sports have you done, what other injuries have you had, and then we even go through almost joint by joint or common areas of injury. So foot pain, ankle issues, knee pain, saddle discomfort, back injuries, shoulders, all those kinds of things that people would commonly, especially in certain sports. So if they're coming from a martial arts or rugby, quite common in the UK, you're going to expect a lot of big impacts and a lot of injuries resulting from that. So teasing these out is going to help you identify issues where potentially an injured body part has been protected naturally by the body, and that they therefore favoured the other side, and there might be some muscle atrophy or a weakness over time as a result of sort of favouring using the other side. And you see this all the time, especially with people with like ACL injuries. So even if it's surgically repaired and they don't get any pain, the body and the central nervous system will naturally protect the injured knee, because it's very good at protecting you from pain, and it remembers the pain that was associated with that knee, and it tries to protect you from feeling that ever again. So there's a psychological aspect to injury that we often don't talk about, where you have to retrain the brain that these movements aren't going to cause pain. But that very rarely occurs, because with PTs, physiotherapists, historically it's all been about getting them moving again, getting them strong again, and that side of things. But actually the injury, the pain, the sort of inhibition, the unwillingness to do those actions again can last far longer than the physical issue in the first place, so the injury. The foot assessment, we spend a lot of time looking at the foot, how stable it is, whether it's appropriate for the shoes that they're wearing, and whether they need some arch supports and insoles. The physical assessment, again, when we talk about process, the physical assessment is one of the things that is, it's strict in the sense that we have a few key exercises that we will do with everybody, but it's flexible in the sense that if we get a result from one of those exercises that we don't like, we may explore further. So talking about that single leg squat slide that we showed earlier, if we see a result that we don't like the knee collapsing medially, then we may put an insole in there, we may do a resisted sideline leg raise. There are other things on top of that single exercise. So it's kind of, the physical assessment is a standard protocol if everything's fine. It's when it's not fine that you start to expand on those things to try and find more evidence to point in the direction of a hypothesis or a potential solution. On-bike assessments as well, really important. We've already mentioned that sometimes things that you see off the bike don't transfer onto the bike, and there can be various reasons for those, but equally, sometimes you see things where they test very well off the bike, but then you get them on the bike and those movement patterns are less than ideal, let's say. So it's really important to put together all of these pieces and make the decision, and not necessarily, as Curtis Cramblett mentioned in a presentation he did at ICS ISCO a few years ago. It's not about what we want to do with the fit, it's about what the client needs us to do. So the process is important to make sure that you catch everything, but you have to focus on the things that are significant to the client and are going to give them the biggest benefit. So, don't go chasing this lack of medial deviation on the knee movement if it's not really causing them any problems, and they are getting huge saddle issues, neck pain, things like that. They might be related, but you get the point. The on-bike assessment as well, we can't hit home enough the idea that you need to look at people from multiple angles. So what you see from one side might look completely different from the other, especially if there's a big asymmetry, and what you see from the side will always mask what you see from the front. So movement patterns from the side might look perfectly normal and good, and then you look from the front and you're seeing all this knee deviation and movement that is not helping them move the pedals around, instability, all those kinds of things. So what we're doing is creating a process that allows us to capture as much information as possible, create a hypothesis, test that hypothesis, and we said in those critical reasoning webinars, we're lucky in that our interventions are very rarely permanent. So we can throw a wedge in there, we can put an insole in there. If it doesn't work, take it back out again, try something else. We can raise the saddle until things look even worse, lower it back down again until they look better. We can, test and retest and go through a trial and error process. We don't need to commit day one to this is exactly going to be the solution, and that's all we're ever going to do. We're pretty flexible, and we can test hypotheses and see what works for this particular individual. So moving on to the sort of the Fit Studio side of the process, the service, and we talked about getting the customer to buy in, to trust you. in a fit studio that looks like that, professional, clean, everything's laid out nicely. We've got some big TV screens on the wall back there to take them through what we've done, why we've done it, and show them exactly why we've made the decisions we have. That's a completely client-centric environment. So we're going to talk in a second about the fitter, but as far as the client is concerned, when they walk in there, they can see why the grid's on the back wall. It helps them see things that we can see. It helps us talk through the changes we've made and what we're seeing that they might not be able to. And this is always, obviously, as bike fitters, if you have an Instagram account or if you use Instagram, you're going to see these before and after videos. And sometimes, because the picture's tiny, you're kind of like, well, which is the before, which is the after? Because on a small screen, it's quite hard to tell the difference. But that fitter has seen a massive change in the rider, and so much so that they want to share it on social media. But in a tiny little picture, you sometimes struggle, even as a trained bike fitting professional, to see what the difference was pre and post. That's completely different when you're showing a client something with a grid in the background on a screen that's at least sort of 36 inches across. Everything's bigger, everything's much easier to identify, to talk through with the client. That's a key point. If they understand why you're doing what you're doing, and they're involved in the process, the buy-in is a completely different level. So take them on the journey with you, support the decisions you're making. Don't just jump in and say, we're going to raise your saddle, we're going to shorten your stem, and away you go. Show them why you're making those decisions, and then they'll trust in the process much more than if you just jump in and do what you want. So
one of the key things that I just wanted to share, just go back 1 second, Andy, is about our processes. The most important thing in a fit studio, or the thing that jumps out at me when I look at this picture of the studio I'm sitting in right now, that picture with the athlete that's on the screen right now, is the 2 chairs. And it's the 2 chairs side by side. So generally, our cycling analysis professionals will sit in the right-hand chair, the athlete sits in the left-hand chair, and Andy said we bring this person on a journey, which is what we do. But it's a kinematic, and it's a journey where we're helping their proprioceptive awareness, we're educating their proprioceptive intelligence so they can see what's going on. It's not, hey, I've changed a bunch of things, I like the angle, we're moving on. It's sitting down and creating that cycling analysis experience where when they go out on the ride and it feels odd, they're going to know that, well, I started out and my leg was kind of bunched up and my knee was hurting and all this stuff. And then we went through all these changes and I understand how those changes felt. And my fitter prepared me that when I go outside, I'm going to be firing different muscles. It's all going to feel a little bit funky and different. But I know there was a process, and I know that this fitter took me through a process. And I know that I sat in an environment where that whole thing was transparent. So we talk to our athletes all the time about this concept of, we want you to know your why. So know your why, as in why we did something. It's really important for us to educate them why. So as when there's a question, we can have a more intelligent interaction with them on a follow-up, but then also that they're more likely to go through that adaptation process and come out the other side. So why do I think we should be the people out there pushing cycling analysis, or what's the basis for this? Well, the basis for us wanting to push this and share it with everybody is, we know it works. We've got 3 fit studios. We will do most years over $200,000 a year in fit fees, because this cycling analysis concept and system and sitting side by side with your client, all of that works. That's why we have 3 fitters. That's why Andy's on staff. That's why we're the emperors, or the super enthusiastic people about process and about how do we get people to do this in a more structured way. So it's not just, we're not just, trying to say, hey, we know better than everybody else. We're trying to say, actually, customers react really well to this. They have better outcomes and they're more motivated. So that's why we want to share this with you. That's why we're in education. That's why we're in technology, is because it works.
Yeah. So two really key points to pick out from that as well, or that you just reminded me of. Firstly, I think with how busy we are, the important thing to remember about that is we do very little marketing to end consumers. The business we gather is from repeat business. It's from word of mouth, which is the really big one. And I think you know that something's successful when people go through the process, and not only do they buy in and enjoy the end result, but they enjoy it so much that they recommend it to others. So there's that old sort of rule of thumb that if somebody has a bad experience, they'll tell 10 people, but if they have a good experience, they'll only tell 3. So imagine how many people have to have enjoyed the process that we take them through to work entirely on referrals and word of mouth when they're only telling 3 people each. You know, it's a really powerful tool for your fit studio if you can make every single client into a sort of, you know, I can't think of the word, but somebody who goes out and almost does your advertising for you.
An ambassador.
Ambassador, that's the word. Thank you. And then the second thing was when you look at those screens on the back wall there, we can show people things that they can't feel. So sometimes you get that client who is a little bit difficult to work with because they can't feel any of the changes you make. You know, you slide the cleat all the way from the front to all the way to the back, and you know, oh, I don't feel any different. And then you raise the saddle 3 centimeters, and no, it doesn't really feel any different. And you know, they're just not in tune with their body. But going through this process and using the objective data that we gather, we can still show them that what we're doing is making changes, and we can support our hypothesis even if it doesn't necessarily feel different to them because you know, they're just not in tune with their body in the right way. So the next one, the Fit Studio, is also fitter centric. So it's very easy for us to show you a picture of a Fit Studio and say, oh yeah, it's client centric, and it does need to be that, or that's how their perception of it needs to be. But obviously it won't function unless the fitter has everything that they need, tidy, well organized, easy to access, to do their job effectively. You know, on the back wall there with behind Barry, we've got a measuring tool to measure bikes accurately and repeatably. You know, a person with a tape measure does a pretty good job, but a system like this, it doesn't matter who's using it, you'll get the same result. And that's the difference. So you know, that speeds up measurements, it increases accuracy. To the left of that is another workbench filled with, a tool stand filled with all the tools that you could need during the fit. And to the right hand side of the screen there, you can see a little kind of oven to heat mold things. To the right of that is a sink to for water to wash anything if we need to do VO2 max testing, for example, and we've got a mask that's filled with saliva and we need to rinse that out, or anything like that. We have designed the Fit Studios to be open and flexible, to be able to use them for multiple different things, but the key is that the fitter walks into that studio knowing everything they need to do their job that day is there in front of them, and they know exactly where everything is, and it's therefore smoother, quicker, and easier for them. And the key thing is that links very, very well to that previous slide, because that organization, that the fact that you've got everything you need in one place looks very good from a client's perspective. They see that you're organized, they see that you've thought this through, that you've done this several times before, and that the process is smooth and well organized. You know, I keep saying that, but that phrase, but that's what it is. So organization, keeping things tidy, keeping things where they need to be is really, really important. So the Fit Studios as well, this is the opposite wall to what you just saw with the bike measuring tool. So we've got the camera there, we've got the 2 big screens, the same as in the other Fit Studio. We've got some models of a pelvis on the back wall there. Up here, we've got the 2 seats next to each other, as Porrick was mentioning. We've got a couch just over here so that people can sit comfortably while they're talking to us about their injury history and all those kinds of things. Where's my cursor gone? Right. But the Fit Studio is designed to be accurate. It's designed to give us fast data, and it's very focused on the fit and giving us the evidence we need to make decisions. So this platform that the bike's on as well, that rotates, so we can look at lots of different angles using the same camera, using the same software. The Jabirmize software you can see on the left-hand screen there, that gives us a lot of data as well, lots of different saddles along the wall, so we can swap out and make some changes as we need to. But this kind of environment really emphasizes professionalism. People walk into there knowing that we are geared up for what we're doing, we have everything we need, and it's just incredibly professional. It's reassuring from their perspective as a client that you obviously value this service that you're offering. So with cycling analysis, the setting is as important as the process. You know, you can't expect the client to have the same experience if you're just putting up an indoor trainer in the middle of a shop floor and you've just kind of moved some bikes out of the way and away you go. It's a completely different feel for that client compared to walking into a room like this, where this is a completely closed room. There is a door that gets closed behind the client. It is a private room. They don't feel like they can't tell you about personal medical or injury issues because they feel a bit more secure and private. You know, that's important as well. If you can't get them to open up and tell you about their medical issues, then potentially you're not going to be able to piece together the puzzle that helps explain the discomfort that they're experiencing on the bike. So you know, privacy, all those kinds of things are super important. And then the process that we go through, we talk about processes all the time, and within the fit there's one process. You start here, you end here, but in the process of selling a bike, there's another process as well, and the way we think that should be approached is that it should be fit first. So you find out what your optimal position is, then you find the bikes that will allow you to achieve that position, and then you go through something like this, which can tailor the bike if that's possible from the manufacturer. But certainly in most cases you can pick a color, you can discuss how you're going to swap the saddle, you're going to change the crank length maybe, swap the stem or the handlebar width. It's not about just finding the right bike for them and then saying, right, go away and buy that and that's it, because you then have to put the position on there. You've then got to put the settings on there for the right saddle, the right crank length, the right pedal system, the right handlebar position. And so if you think about me as a client walking into a bike shop, do I want to look around on my own and have some salesperson kind of try and push a sale bike that's got 30% off at the moment? You know, that it might be a great deal if it fits me, but if it doesn't fit me, it's the biggest waste of money possible. So I want to go into a shop, I want to go through that fit process, know what works for me, then find bikes that will allow that position, and then go through the process of finally tailoring that bike to achieve that exact position, and maybe even go through another fit at the end just to make sure that everything is transferred over, and that any changes that we couldn't work around. For example, if the saddle that I prefer is no longer made, we might have to try and figure out another solution that gives me the same kind of feel. If the handlebars and stem are one piece and I don't necessarily want to swap that, then you know we want to go through that process and try and find a solution that works for the client. In most cases, we would say swap it because it's not the right position, but we've all had clients who really want to stick with that $200-300 bar stem combo that looks really nice, even if it doesn't necessarily fit them. But going through that process, again, you've got evidence, you've shown them why you think it should be in a different position, and oftentimes they can feel that, and having an adjustable size cycle or a fit bike or anything like that can really help them interpret the difference between, yeah, this is the bike you like, but it doesn't work for you, and this is how that would feel, and this is the position that we would suggest. And then, you know, I used to work in a store that only sold 2 bike brands. One of them was super low and long, the other was a bit shorter and higher. The first one did lots of advertising and brought people into the store. The second one is the one we sold most, because when you got them on a size cycle and went, this is how it's going to feel, I think it's too low and too long for you, this is how the other bike feels, even if they didn't know the other brand, they would go, yeah, I want one of them instead, because they can feel the difference. They've gone through that process, and so many stores would have just gone, okay, you want that bike? Yeah, it's how many £1,000? There you go, and not really care about how the customer feels. The best example of that I have is a guy came to me from another city. He was an hour's drive away or just over, which for the UK is quite a lot. It's nothing in the US, but in the UK, he'd made an effort. There were probably a dozen or 20 stores between me and him, but he made the point of coming to me because he wanted to go through this process. So he came in with about a $10,000 budget, something like that, and obviously as a retailer at the time, I was quite excited by the concept of this expensive bike, and it was one of these low and long bikes, and we couldn't get anywhere close. So he didn't initially go for the second option. He didn't like the way it looked. He'd come in with his heart set on this initial bike, but I'd refused to sell it to him. I said, it's not going to work for you. You're going to get lower back pain. You're going to get neck and shoulder issues. You're going to get numb hands. It's not the position you need for the riding you're doing for your shape and size. So he went away a little bit disappointed. Lovely guy, don't get me wrong. It wasn't anything. He wasn't annoyed with me. He was frustrated at the situation. Didn't want to commit to another bike that he hadn't even considered. Went away, and I didn't hear anything for a couple of days, thinking I'd lost a big sale. Then he got back in touch and he said, can you show me that bike that again that you suggested at the time? So talked him through it, showed him some things. He suggested some other bikes that he liked the look of. We showed him the geometry and what that would do, and how different it was to what we suggested. And ultimately, he went down the route of the bike that we suggested. It took a little bit of time, a little bit of convincing, but he spent 10 grand on a bike that he hadn't ever considered before he walked in my door. And then he was so pleased with the fit and the position that 6-8 months later, his winter bike needed replacing, and he spent another 3.5 grand on that with me. So in a year, I turned a customer walking out of my door, refusing to sell him a bike, into 13-14 grand's worth of sales. And that's not because I'm a smooth salesman or anything like that. I don't have a salesy bone in my body. It's because the process I go through and the value that I have and that I put across in the fit, I think helps people understand why I want to keep them comfortable on the bike, why I suggest the bikes I do. And customers really, really value that. So the process he went through with us was exactly this one that we're showing on the screen here. We tailored the bike to him completely. We found a frame that worked. We spec'd it up with wheels and group set that he wanted. The saddle and the handlebars and the stem length were all tailored to the position that we thought we would need. And he walked out the door with exactly what he wanted. And that process is incredibly powerful. If you get it right, that person does become an advocate for your store. You don't lose a sale, you gain a customer for life. And he came back for fits every couple of years, and every time he needed a new part, new bike, he'd make that journey to me, passing 20 other stores on the way. That's because you go through that process, the customer sees the value that you apply to your service, and they value it as well. If you don't value the fit, if you don't value the sizing or the sales process, then they won't either, and they'll just buy something online based on price and not based on anything else that we actually should value as cyclists and as bike fitters. So those of you who have used Pure Position before or have at least seen it before, once you've done a fit with somebody and input some data, this is the kind of output you might see. And it's a couple of years old now, so it's showing some 2017 and 2018 bikes, but this is kind of showing you how close you can get to the position that you've input, what stem you would need, what angle you would need on the stem, what spaces you would need, all these kinds of things, and then how far away from the exact position you would get. So even showing the customer this kind of thing really emphasizes that that concept that this is the bike that will fit me the best. These are the ones that are in an okay window, and those ones I need to discount completely. It's just providing data for that customer to make a good decision.
The other nice thing about what you see here in the screen is, so you'll see on the left-hand column, you'll see the bike and the size. The next column, you'll see in the top one, it says 0.5 millimeters. That's 0.5 millimeters away from the XY coordinates that you have defined as their optimal position. So this, in a fairly agnostic, so it's not a biased system, it sorts the bikes by how well they fit the customer's handlebar XY coordinates. It's a $300 a year program. We use it every day. We put every single customer through there that's looking for a bike or looking for a solution. And what it does for us as cycling analysis professionals, it elevates us again because we're prioritizing their fit first. So and we joke with our customers, our job is to find where to put your ass and your hands in space. That's your job as a bike fitter. It's ass and hands in space. Once you figure that out, your secondary job is figuring out what you're going to put under their ass and hands to get them to where they need to be. And that handlebar saddle XY focus on a rigorous process, focus on biomechanics, focus on analysis, that's what yields results. And then at the end of that process, when you can go, you see there's Treks on that, there's Giants on that, they're specialized on it. When you can do a multi-brand search and go, boom, here's what you need, or here's how well they fit. And you can see in this example, if you look at the third column, these are terrible solutions because they're all plus 25-degree stems. So we'd go back to the well on this and say, okay, well, let's restrict it that it'll only show us negative angle stems, and then it'll show us different solutions. So the client can see the transparency in the process. And again, you're not a shill just pushing something their way that, you know, suits you as a fitter or a retailer. You're putting them first. You're putting them in the center of the process and making it all about them. And they see the loyalty, that conversation that Andy had with that client. I have clients that I had in 2000 that came to New York to buy bikes off me when I worked with Serrata, that still come back in and are still clients from a 2-hour fit process in 2000 because it was the same kind of experience.
Yeah, I think so. What we're going to run through now is just some of the services that we offer to give you an idea of that process that we go through. So our standard cycling analysis comes with pressure. We use pressure mapping for all of our fits because we find it such a valuable tool. It takes 3 hours because there's a lot of detail that goes into it. So there's that standard process, just as a simplistic outline of pre-fit interview, physical assessment, foot assessment, 360 video analysis, so from all 4 of the main sides, and then pressure mapping as well. And obviously each of those will develop and expand as we find things that we want to explore further. But that's the rough structure that we will go through with absolutely every client. And this video on the next screen is going to show you sort of Barry having a bit of a chat with the client as the pre-fit interview. There's the foot assessment with the Brannick devices and the naviculometer, and then the physical assessment with some basic range of motion exercises. Jump to a different client with a on-bike assessment with some different markers on there. And then sat alongside the fitter, the client looks at themselves on the bike, associates themselves with that movement, sees the pressure, and hopefully that helps, you know, them visualize what they are feeling. And sometimes it's very hard for them to describe what they're feeling, but if they can see it on the screen, they'll go, yes, that's where it hurts. And then this video takes them through the size cycle component and the bike sizing aspect, so finding a bike that will fit and then customizing that bike to their needs. So obviously with every client, it's not a new bike. So some of them are being, well, the majority are being fit on their existing bikes. But if they were being fit with a new bike in mind, that would show you the kind of process that we go through. And that would be easily 3 hours to do a full fit, and then potentially a bit more to add on the bike sizing and the bike sort of concierge service on the end there. So this is an example video of the 360 analysis that we talk about, looking from each angle. So stop motion, we've got some markers being put on, one angle, capture video, another angle, capture the video, rotate again, capture the video, then 3 different hand positions on the handlebar, with the pressure mapping software on the left-hand screen there. And then the key point, get the rider sat down, talk through what you've seen on the bike, what you've seen with their movement patterns, and then take them into pure position again and look for something that's going to be an appropriate fit. So another service we're lucky enough to offer is the medical cycling analysis. So our process of that is very, very similar. The clients spend about 2.5 hours with us as fitters, but they also spend about 1.5 hours with a PT, a physical therapist, physiotherapist next door. We're lucky enough to share a facility where we're separate companies, but there's an internal door where we can just walk into their treatment areas and ask for PT referrals and all those kinds of things. So to be able to have a medical assessment where they can look into every aspect of that person's movement, their restrictions and strengths and weaknesses, and make recommendations based on that, that's a hugely powerful thing. So the last point there is the option of doing custom orthotics. So to have that through a medical facility rather than just heat mold to the person's foot, that's a little bit different. There's going to be something in that orthotic that is a sort of prescription. It's going to try and change how the foot moves and how the foot functions. So a message came through from Patrick there. I tried the Pure Position software some years ago, but was disappointed by the poor database. Has it been improved? If yes, do you have a test version? Porrick, perhaps you can answer that one.
From a European bike perspective, it is still doesn't have a huge database. If there are bike brands that you deal a lot with, and those bike brands are interested in being in the database, actually the biggest limiter we have is bike companies supplying accurate information. Plus, the type of information that we ask them for is much more detailed than sometimes they want to invest time in giving us. But there is a feature in the software where if you have the geometry page, let's say it's a cube, or let's say it's a brand that isn't readily available over here in the US, you can put in the stack and reach dimensions, the head tube angle, the seat tube angle, and with that information, you can add any bike, as long as you have the fit dimensions, into the system, and then you can take, here's their bike fit, and then run their bike fit against the geometry of a specific bike. Now, the only thing you have to pay attention to as a bike fitter in that scenario is that they can, of course, stand over the bike. But it will give you the same renderings of the stem, the handlebar, how many spacers, all that information. If you have a mystery bike, so it's a God knows what it is bike, or you can't find the geometry, we've also created a wizard in the software where you can use an XY tool to get stack and reach of the top and the bottom of the seat tube angle, or sorry, of the head tube. You then get, if you have those two stack and reaches, obviously it'll give us a head tube angle, which will allow us to give more accurate information for the front end of the bike. And then similarly with the back end of the bike, if you can estimate what the seat tube angle is using a digital protractor, or using manual protractor, or a spirit level protractor, then you can put that bike into the system also. The only thing that's difficult sometimes, if it's a frame, obviously the bike has to be level to do stack and reach or head tube, top and bottom XYs. So the database is small if there are particular European brands you're dealing with, but there's a pathway to putting those brands in if that would help you out, and that's easy for us to do. We just need the information.
Yep. Okay. So on to the next slide. One of the other services we offer is aero analysis. Again, we went into a lot more detail in this in our aerodynamics webinar, but we have a virtual wind tunnel here, as you can see from the picture. So a green screen estimates frontal area, The software does allow you to alter the coefficient of drag component if you wanted to. And then we can make changes to the bike, to the position, and see what potential performance gains there would be as a result of that. We can also pair this with our MotionMetriq software that looks at the rider from the side. So whilst we're doing an aero analysis, we can also do a positional analysis and look at saddle position, knee angles, ankle position, all those kinds of things. We often use a Zephyr system, which helps us to identify breathing patterns, and especially in aggressive TT positions, we want to make sure that we aren't restricting their breathing rates or their breathing patterns by getting them so aggressive. Because if we do that, then there's a point where the aerodynamic benefits or the aero gains are massively outweighed by the performance detriment caused by an inability to breathe and function properly. So that's something that we use to monitor, that just increases the fidelity of the information and increases the likelihood that what we create in the studio recreates outdoor in terms of performance gains. Notio is something that we're keen to work with. So that allows for outdoor testing. It's a little sensor that sits on the front of the bike. We can do that in the real world. We can go up and down a fairly flat road. We can even, with the GBMI system, we can sit in a car behind and gather live pressure mapping data alongside live drag data. So that allows us to test sustainability of these aero positions. So I think the key thing with this is cycling analysis isn't just where do we need your saddle height. It can be so much more. Aero analysis becomes part of that, and there's lots of tools that make that readily available to most bike fitters. So what we're going to do now is just show you a couple more videos. This is Porrick running some aero testing along with Daniel from Gebirmized and the Trek Segafredo guys at an indoor velodrome. So they were setting up a fit area where we could do assessments of the position. There was a table there in the background where the aero data would be captured. So going through this with riders allows us to assess multiple things at the same time on the same day, and half a day in the track with some bike fit adjustments and records being taken alongside that is really powerful for the athlete. And then final one here is a similar kind of setup with a mobile fit studio, if you like. When Porrick goes and fits for the team camps, it's often in the basement of a hotel or whatever small room they've got, and this is the kind of setup that we're able to take with us for those training camps.
And you can see the principles are the same. So we're still setting up 2 screens, albeit not big ones. We're still sitting side by side with the athlete. We're still setting up multiple cameras so we can look at both sides of the body. The principles are the same. So if you're a cycling analysis professional and this is how you go out into the world and work with people, that professionalism and that process, is the same no matter where you're working. And it can be sometimes very challenging environmentally, and we've had to make custom lights and all sorts of things to make this work on the road. But we have a massage table, we have all the lasers, we have all the hardware, software that we have here. In fact, they store it for us in Belgium and then they bring it to all these events. But there's also, in the previous one where it was the aero testing, we had an aerodynamicist, we had product engineers, we have Daniel the scientist, we have Porrick the bike fitter, we have Nate the physical therapist, we have the coaches, and it's a collaboration. But it's a non-negotiable that we don't have these tools to help the rider understand this is what I'm doing with my body. Before I sit them on the track, before we go to that level of detail, they have to understand what the heck their body is doing in space. And we can take a guy who loses 4 places on GC in the final day of the Tour de France to coming third as a GC contender / climber in a world tour event last year, you know, the only way that happens is that you change their mindset and change their sense of what their body is doing and why, and you back it up with all the levels of data for that to happen. And that's the fundamentals of cycling analysis. It's not about throwing a bunch of data at the person. It's making sure they understand the data and the postural cues you're trying to get that person to adopt.
Yeah. So final slide then. We just obviously we're keen for people to continue learning just as we enjoy continued education. So next webinar is Monday the 15th of June with Daniel from Jabirmeist. He's going to talk us through the whole saddle range, but really focusing on the Stride TT saddle. We've just announced pretty much today, really, the new course calendar for this year. So we'll be running each of our level 1, 2, and 3 courses in November, and then again at the end of January and early February. So we'd love to see you join us for those. If you do want to book on to any of the courses or any of the training that we offer, my email address is down at the bottom. If you drop me an email, we'll get all of that organised for you. And we are continuing with our one-on-one webinars, so $75 for an hour. You can pick the topic, we can cover whatever you want to cover. And our previous webinars have all been recorded. Any of the free webinars that we've ran on Fridays will be available for free on YouTube. Any of the paid webinars will be available to purchase on Vimeo. So any questions at any point, do just shout up. You can get in touch with me by the email address at the bottom, and at any stage, if you think of some questions regarding this webinar or any of the others over the next week or so, just let us know. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Thanks for that's very nice of you to say, Patrick. Very interesting webinar again. Thank you. Yeah,
and I just wanted to thank everybody as well, and just say I apologize if we sometimes come across super evangelical about this is, you know, a philosophy or this is the way of doing things. We're as passionate about learning and teaching as we are about technology, as we are about process and all those things. And one of the things that's been great for me professionally is to have Andy and his sports science background on board. It's to have Nate and all the people from you know, endurance rehab with all the anatomical and physical therapy knowledge. You know, for me, the only constant for us to survive and to grow and to thrive and to have a career is for us to grow all the time. And you know, that's a big part of the reason Andy's on the team. And I guess if we're encouraging anything to you as a group of peers and a group of people we respect, is, you know, cycling analysis is a great way forward. And if we can be a part of helping you achieve what you want to achieve financially, business-wise, and outcomes-wise with your clients, we'd love you to be a part of our education and to continue to be a part of it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, and yeah, hopefully we see you all again soon. Now that things are picking up with everybody returning to work, our webinar calendar is going to be a little bit more sparse. We'll run one in the middle of June and look to run another maybe a couple of weeks after that, depending on how busy everybody gets. But yeah, thanks for joining us, and yeah, see you again soon.